Today we're going to be covering another part of the history of Flora Fountain, also known as Slab Town in more recent years. And one of the first things that we'll look at here is a map of B-Town. It's a little earlier one, used by the Grant County Genealogical Society, showing where, with the black dots, originally were red, but with the photocopy it turned out black, where different one-room schools were held. And in the one area there, we could see where approximately where the one was for Slab Town or Flora Fountain. Because today we'll be talking about how those names came up and why really Slab Town kind of won out in the long run, but it's interesting, and we'll be covering about that and a little bit about a mill that existed, lumber mill and that, and another business that existed there at the time. Flora was named for the myriads of wildflowers which grew on the surrounding bluffs and fountain for the spring across the river. The early settlers conveyed this spring across the river in trowels made of basswood bark, thus forming the fountain, suggesting the name. But other conditions, however, soon suggested a name by which this place became so generally known as to almost displace the one originally given. After the sawmill was put in operation, slabs were piled about in great quantities. They could be had for little and were used for many purposes. Fences were built of slabs, and some of the buildings about the sawmill were made of the same material. It is known that at least one dwelling was sited with slabs, and 1 year's school was held in a slab building. The story also has it that prairie farmers passing through fell into the habit of helping themselves to this useful material. Some little controversy which arose between the mill owners and these farmers still further advertised the name, and for miles around it became known as Slab Town. So generally that few remembered that we ever possessed another name. People traveling from Lancaster to Bloomington would refer to the settlement they went through as Slab Town because of the many buildings with slabs for siding or roofs, or made entirely of slabs. Now also here's a few comments concerning how Pleasant Ridge got that name. Pleasant Ridge was named by the Negroes for Pleasant Valley in Marin County, Virginia, from which the Horner Group came in 1848. Other people referred to the area as Darky Ridge, Negro Ridge, or the Darky Settlement. On the ridge road about a mile from Flora toward Lancaster was the heart of Pleasant Ridge, where their community buildings and cemetery were located. The fine stone house of Mr. Ross still stands about a mile, now of course this is in 1966, and a mile and a half out of Lancaster. The Negroes' homes occupied the ridge and slopes in the intervening miles. Now I'd like to get into a little history of the village site. The first settlers at the Flora Town site were George and Martha Nivette Blackburn, sometimes spelled Blackborn or Blackborn with an E by others. So this is not uncommon in the older days, just deciding for sure how was something spelled. There are different spellings. Sometimes it's harder to trace genealogy, your family history that way sometimes because it changes. He came from England in 1848 and settled on the farm which later became the community center of the Flora era in 1856. This farm was taken over by his son John and wife Alice Houghton Blackburn in 1865. Sylvester and Martha Allen Blackburn, Bell's camper, John's daughter and husband, moved on in 1892. James and Bethania Houghton Ilift started to farm here about 1899, and sometime around 1910, John Edwards bought the farm and sold it in 1911 to his son-in-law and daughter, William and Elsie Garthwaite, who owned it until its present owner, at the time here in 1966, Bernal Bishop, purchased it a few years ago. George Blackburn was always a publicly spirited man and willingly let others obtain building sites on his farm. He deeded land for the first school. His relative, James Iliff, was also generous. He gave land for the Latter-day Saints Church and Cemetery for $1 to bind the deal. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the lumber mill and what happened. Due to the good weather location, people began to make plans for a sawmill at the site to be called Flora. In the Grant County Herald at this date, there are accounts of this shortage of lumber for buildings. People were coming into Lancaster and having to live in with others. They called it doubling up. This site, halfway between Lancaster and Bloomington, adjacent to the joining of the strong streams surrounded by wooded hills, was ideal for a lumber mill. Logs were cut by Edmund Greene, Frank Fay, William Biswick, William McLean, and a Mr. Taylor. Biswick did the carpenter work on the flume and the sawmill. Several houses were built at this time, some of logs, others sided with footboards, slabs. On the ground where the first school would later stand, a boarding house was built to house the workers at the sawmill. Mrs. John Blackburn cooked for them. Grandma Bishop, who was the Emma Blackburn, helped her mother. The mill owners were a couple Campbells, and the mill was put into operation in 1858. In 1861, it was sold to George Blackburn and William McLean. At the night of the first day, it was operated by the new owners. The mill burned down with strong suspicion of foul play. Legal action was started, but no plain evidence developed and the matter was dropped. Blackburn and McLean suffered complete loss and the mill was never rebuilt. And one other thing I would like to do about another enterprise, another operation, other than farming, has never succeeded for any length of time at Flora, but there was always been those who have had their dreams of a greater town, and it was not long after the Civil War until another boom was experienced. At this time, Wallace Selleck came, built a store building, purchased the old mill property, and prepared to rebuild, but never got beyond putting in a few flume bridges. Barrow Irish says that several years ago they were straightening the channel of the river to cut down on flooding and discovered several of these old flumes or remnants of a dam near where the mill stood. They were made of layers of willow branches weighted down with rocks. Having been buried in the dirt and water, the willow was well preserved, and so was destroyed the last evidence of the old mill. Even the river was damaged was changed from its early day course and wanders less tumultuously along. So again, to give you a little idea of some of the other things covered, we can't do a whole lot, but it goes on with all the different things that were established, what happened to various stores or businesses. Post office, of course, was located there for a while. In fact, that was kind of interesting. When someone mentioned about Slab Town as a post office name, well, higher ups in the postal department elsewhere decided that didn't seem appropriate. So they settled on Flora Fountain, but then didn't want so long, so Flora there for a while. So they did have a post office for a while, not too many years, before everything got shifted off to the Lancaster direction. But this goes on in such great detail and so interesting, mentioning some of the earliest people, different things that managed to happen over the years, and how things changed. So it goes into great detail, very informative, and we will be working on kind of getting this easier to read in the future. One problem that we have, of course, is that because of the virus epidemic, we have to limit use of the facility. I'm here in the history room by myself. I can look up some things if it isn't too detailed in that. But the time hopefully will be coming sometime this year that we, as soon as possible, can open up where people can come, because there's lots of interesting things, some new things that we're able to do, but it's best when you can come in and actually participate in it. So in our little book here from Grant County, we have a picture here of the Flora Fountain School back here in 1926-27, and the group there, even the names there are covered in this picture here. We wish we had more pictures, but so far been difficult to find, and we're still trying to look maybe some other sources where we can find more pictures here of Flora Fountain or Slab Town. That completes our part here that we're covering today.